Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the prophecy of the 70 weeks in Daniel chapter 9. Daniel chapter 9, verse 1 starts off in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of Median descent, who was made king over the kingdom. Notice, it doesn't say the kingdom of the Persians, it says the kingdom of the Chaldeans. That's just a small part of what eventually would be the Persian Empire. And so we came up with, and we suggested already, two possibilities. We talked about this back in at the end of Daniel chapter 9, chapter 5, I'm sorry, where we saw Darius the Mede. And we suggested, A, this is possible that Darius the Mede was an early governor of Babylon under Cyrus. Notice it doesn't say that he was over all the Persian Empire, which it should have said that. Or the other possibility, admittedly, is that Darius the Mede was another name for Cyrus himself. You say, well, I thought Cyrus was a Persian. If we believe Herodotus in the report that he gives, Cyrus was both. His grandfather had been the king of the Medes. Notice that might have been the Ahasuerus here of Median descent. Ahasuerus, I think, was probably became sort of a family name, and we're going to see a number of kings by the name of Ahasuerus. Um, and then Cyrus eventually took over from his grandfather. Again, if we believe Herodotus, it wasn't a friendly taking over. But by in one way or another, he acquired both the Medes and the Persians. And so either way, with either of these possibilities, this is soon after Cyrus has captured Babylon. Either this is referring to Cyrus himself, or this is one of his early governors. But there has been this transition. And so we read in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus of Median descent, who was made king over the kingdom of the Chaldeans. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, observed in the books the number of the years which was revealed as the word of the Lord to Jeremiah. Notice in the first year of his reign, this is Daniel chapter 5 has just come to pass. And now he's reading from Jeremiah the prophet. The book of Jeremiah was already written, and apparently Daniel has a copy of it. And he's reading in Jeremiah how Jeremiah had prophesied about the completion of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. There's a section in the book of Jeremiah where God had told Jeremiah there will be a Babylonian captivity that will last for 70 years. And now Daniel is asking, gee, I'm doing the math. I've been here for close to 70 years. Are we there yet? So Daniel chapter 9, verse 3, so I gave my attention to the Lord God to seek him by prayer and supplications with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes. Verse 4, I prayed to the Lord my God and confessed and said, alas, O Lord, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant and loving kindness for those who love him and keep his commandments, we have sinned, committed iniquity, acted wickedly, and rebelled, even turning aside from your commandments and ordinances. Verse 6, moreover, we have not listened to your servants the prophets, who spoke in your name to our kings, our princes, our fathers, and all the people of the land. And what Daniel is doing, he is offering a prayer of confession, not for his own personal sin, but on behalf of the people of God, the nation of Judah, which has ceased to be a nation because of the Babylonian captivity, and they've been taken away into captivity. And Jeremiah had promised that there would be an end to that captivity if the people repented. And so, just in case, Daniel was saying, well, let that repentance come and let it begin with me. And he is repenting corporately for the sins of all of the people. Now we get down to verse 20. I'm not going to go all through the prayer, but while I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, that's what he's been doing, this corporate confession, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God in behalf of the holy mountain of my God, while I was still speaking in prayer, then the man Gabriel, he said, I thought Gabriel was an angel. Yes, but he's a masculine angel. So the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision previously, we saw him in an earlier chapter, came to me in my extreme weariness about the time of the evening offering. That is, as the sun is going down, that's the time of the evening offering. You have a morning offering and an evening offering back in the temple, but now there is no temple, but they still remember the times, and Daniel would still use these times for prayer. Verse 24, Gabriel shows up and now gives an answer to Daniel's prayer, and he explains to him 70 weeks have been decreed. Now, I guess you could translate that 77s, but that's because there isn't a separate word for week in Hebrew. The way you say week in Hebrew is a group of sevens, which is normally 7 days. So 70 weeks works as a good translation. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish their transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. We'll look at that list in just a moment, but notice 70 weeks. You say, well, gee, 70 weeks, there's only 52 weeks in a year. Is this like a year and a half? And nearly everybody agrees, no, that's not the case. They're actually borrowing here from a place in Ezekiel that talks about how a day is going to represent a year. So a week would represent 7 years. And you do the math, just 70 weeks times 7, that comes to a period of time of, if a day represents a, a, uh, a year, then that would be 490 years. And I think, and I'm not the only one, quite a few scholars, almost all the scholars that I know of, think maybe that's the case here. Either it represents an indeterminate period of time or a very specific time of 490 years. But we're going to see that divided into segments, and we'll look at that in just a moment. First of all, let's look at this list. This list of what takes place over these 77s, over these 70 weeks, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. And I would submit that for the Christian sees this six group of this listing of six events as having taken place at the hands of Jesus, the Messiah, that he is the one who finished the transgression. That's what he accomplished on the cross, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity. That's very obviously Jesus, to bring in everlasting righteousness. It begins with him, to seal up vision and prophecy. He is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. It all points to him. And to anoint the most holy place. You say, well, is that speaking of the temple? Well, sort of, because Jesus said, I am the temple. And he is the anointed one, the way we say that in Greece. He is the Christos, or we just say he is the Christ. 77s. Verse 25, so you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks it will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Now notice, until Messiah the Prince, and we already said the Messiah the Prince, that sounds a lot like Jesus, although I think we will see another candidate, another anointed one. We'll look at him in a moment. But notice, we have from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again. We'll look at the next verse in a moment. But I want you to note that there are some translations, including the English Standard Version. That's not a bad translation, but it slightly changes it from the going out of the word to restore and rebuild Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one. So for Messiah the Prince and the coming of anointed one, a prince, that's the same thing. There shall be 7 weeks. Then, and notice the change, then for 62 weeks it shall be built again. Now that's added by the translators because the Hebrew just says as the vav conjunctive. We normally translate that as and, although then could still work if there's a reason to do that. But notice there's a separation, and the separation is the 7 weeks and 62 weeks both in the New American Standard, and then the English Standard Version sees the same separation, but separates a little more strongly. There'll be 7 weeks, and then just to make sure you see a separation, they put in, then for 62 weeks it will be built again. So in either case, there's a separation between the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks. Is it a strong separation? Is it a conjunctive separation, one right after the other? And it depends which translation we go to. It's an interpretive translation. And so we can have either and or then for. And the question is, how should we understand it? And of course, and works with both translations. Verse 26, then after the 62 weeks, notice it doesn't say then after the 7 and the 60, it just says after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince, you say, well, is that the Messiah or is this somebody else? And in nearly every interpretation, we're going to see that as two different individuals. There's the Messiah, you could call him Messiah the Prince, but there's also the people of the Prince who is to come, will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end, there will be war, desolations are determined. Now, the first question is, what's the time period here? And there are a number of decrees that have been made, and so we look at the decrees. There was a decree under Cyrus the Great in around 539, some will say 538, and I'm not going to quibble about the year, where the Jews were allowed to return and to rebuild the temple, but there was no mention of the walls of the city. And remember, they did go back and they began to rebuild the temple, but then they were interrupted until Darius the Great, and this isn't Darius the Mede, this is a later king of all the Persian Empire, Darius the Great, and his story is told in Ezra chapter 6. In the year 520 BC, he gives permission for the Jews. They had actually started on their own, even though they didn't have permission. They had restarted to complete the temple. An investigation was made. He found out that Cyrus had given a decree they could rebuild the temple, and he said, that's okay, you can continue. They were allowed to complete the temple. And in fact, Darius helped to fund the program. He said, and your taxes can pay for it. And they completed the temple in 516 BC. But the decree was made around 520. Next, we have a decree by Artaxerxes who allows Ezra to bring back another group of Jews, a second return. And we're going to see Ezra says something very interesting about rebuilding the wall at that point. And then finally, we have Artaxerxes, the same king, in Nehemiah chapter 1, gives permission for Nehemiah to go back and rebuild the wall. And this time it is built in the days of Nehemiah. So I've got 4 different decrees. Now, if I look at that period of time, and here, just for argument's sake, I'm putting both the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks together to make 69 weeks, 483 years. And I look at the decree of Cyrus, and I just add those years from 539 BC. That brings me down to 56 BC, at which nothing happened. I mean, prophecy is easier to look at when it's already been fulfilled, but nothing was fulfilled. If I look at the decree of Darius, 520 BC, or the decree of Artaxerxes, 457, or the second decree of Artaxerxes, 445, well, I have 37 BC. Did anything happen there? Well, Herod the Great retook the land of Judea, began his. He'd been made king of the Jews a few years earlier, but that was by the Romans, and now he actually was acting king of the Jews. But I don't know if that really applies here. If we go from the first decree of Artaxerxes in 457 BC and go forward, that brings us to 27 AD, around the time that the ministry of Jesus begins. And that actually might work. Maybe. So that points very nicely to Jesus. If I come to the decree of in the days of Nehemiah, the second decree of Artaxerxes, that brings us to 39 AD, and far too late because nothing happened there, at least with regards to Jesus or any of that. So there's one that would fit with Jesus. Now, let me give you first the Maccabean interpretation. It's not the only interpretation the Jewish people have used, but I think this one will fit the time and not require us to just say 70 weeks is just an unknown period of time. You have 7 weeks, or about this time, about 49 years, from the time when the temple was destroyed, 587, some books will say 586, and I'll take either one, to around 538 BC, where he actually gave the decree a few months earlier at the end of 539, but this still works too. 538 BC, maybe a bit later, or around this time, where the decree is given for the temple to be rebuilt. Notice from temple destroyed to temple being rebuilt. And that works nicely. You say, well, what about those other 62 years? For that, if we go from the first fall of Jerusalem, the time when Daniel first went into captivity, 605 BC, and count 434 years, the 62 weeks, to 171 BC, we have taking place in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, the murder of the high priest. Antiochus Epiphanes arranged for the high priest to have a quote unquote accident so that another Jewish person could be made high priest, somebody who wasn't even from the tribe of Levi, let alone a descendant of Aaron. Um, and this took place in 171 BC as Antiochus made an agreement saying, look, I'll put you on into that position of high priest if you pay me off, take some of the treasury money out of the temple and give it to me. But then Antiochus goes back on that agreement about 3.5 years later. And in the middle of the 70th week, the temple is desecrated by Antiochus. He goes into the temple and he erects a statue of Zeus. We talked about this when we were looking at Daniel chapter 8, and we'll see it again in Daniel chapter 11. So the Maccabean interpretation, the pieces fit, although notice we didn't have the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks. We didn't have them in consecutive order. We had to sort of put them apart. But it still fits. Secondly, we have what's called the dispensational interpretation. Let me just confess here, I'm not a dispensationalist. But this was one devised by Sir Robert Anderson, who was a dispensationalist himself. And he took it from the order in the days of Nehemiah, 444 BC, down to the crucifixion of Christ. Now, the problem is that we said that brings us to 39 AD. The dates don't fit. But he said, that's okay. What we can do is we can change them into special years. We'll change them instead of regular years into special years, 360 days each. And then we'll take that period of time and we'll just compress it by adding up 360 times 39 weeks, so 483. And that will bring us to compressed time and bring us down to the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, I'm a little uncomfortable with changing years. Like, it seems to me that a year would be a year, and then here's the dispensational part, where he says, and then with the crucifixion of Jesus, or maybe a month and a half later, when the Holy Spirit comes, you can take your pick when you want to stop it. But all of a sudden, we stop, and now you have the church age, so you don't go from the 69th week to the 70th week. Instead, there's this big gap. And at the end of the church age, dispensationalists believe that Jesus is going to come again and rapture his people. And then 7 years after that, he comes a third time, but it doesn't really sound good to call that the third coming of Jesus. So we'll just not call the rapture a second coming. We'll just call that Jesus coming to gather his people. And then his official second coming is at the end of that time, at the end of the 70th week. And so that they put that as the second coming of Jesus. And that's the dispensational interpretation. And it's very popular among a lot of Christians. So now it's only been popular for about the last, I'd say, 150, not quite 200 years. And really, it was virtually unknown, especially this way of looking at it was unknown. So it's a recent innovation, which does not make it wrong, but it means that it wasn't something that was obvious to anybody early on in the history of the church. The third interpretation, the historical interpretation, and I just say that to distinguish it from the dispensational view, sees that first decree of Artaxerxes, 457 BC. I can go just normal weeks. I don't have to change them into special years. To around the time of the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, that fits. And you say, well, what about the 70th week? Well, I don't have to split that up either. In other words, I can just see all of this as consecutive. And in the middle of the week, the Messiah is cut off. In other words, Jesus died. Um, and then after that, you say, well, what happened, 3.5 years after that? Well, eventually it didn't happen then, but about 40 years later, you have Jerusalem destroyed. And if you look carefully at the prophecy, it doesn't say that's that happens like on the end of the 70th week, but just as after that, that these things will take place. And so historical interpretation, I don't have to change the numbers. I don't have to separate the years. I don't have to try to put in gaps. I can just leave it the way it is. And that works quite nicely too, to be a prophecy of the coming of Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem, which happened in the year 70 AD. Now, I said Ezra makes mention. This is I know it's a passing reference. Ezra chapter 9, verse 9, where Ezra is praying. It says, we're slaves, yet in our bondage. Our God has not forsaken us, but has extended loving kindness to us in the sight of the kings of Persia to give us reviving, to raise up the house of our God, to restore its ruins, and to give us. And he mentions a wall. Now, that's certainly not conclusive, but it's interesting that he mentions a wall in Judah and Jerusalem. And he doesn't wait till Nehemiah to mention the wall. He mentions it right here. So that verse 26, then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end, there will be war. Desolations are determined. And so we had both a reference to the Messiah and this other prince who is to come, who will destroy the city. Verse 27, and he, who's the he? Well, the last one that was mentioned was this prince who was going to destroy the city. He will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate. Now notice those two words, abomination and desolate, because we're going to see those words again when we get to Daniel chapter 11. But not only that, notice he makes desolate until the complete destruction, when this decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Not only that, but Jesus referenced this as well. Notice what we have here. From the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, it will be built again, the construction that would take place, the construction of the city. And then Messiah would be cut off. But then I have this other person, this other prince, this, if I can call him an anti-Messiah, the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city. I had construction, but now there's destruction. Will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Desolations are determined. And this anti-Messiah will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. And he will put a stop to the sacrifice and grain offering. As I said, Jesus makes reference to this prophecy. He makes reference in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 15, and he's been speaking about how the temple would be destroyed and bad things would take place. And his disciples are asking, when is this going to take place? And he doesn't give them a direct answer, but he says, when therefore you see the abomination of desolation, there's the same two words before, the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place. And they've just come out of the temple. Jesus has just said, see all these things in the temple, it's all going to be destroyed, by the way it was in the year 70 AD. And then Matthew the writer adds, I don't think Jesus said these words, I think Matthew the writer adds, and so our translators put it in parentheses, let the reader understand. As if to say, I know this is strange. I know you thought the Maccabean interpretation was the one that took place. After all, that had already been fulfilled in the days of Jesus. But now Jesus is saying, wait a minute, I'm predicting something that's going to happen in my future. That is not had already taken place before the birth of Jesus, but that would take place still in the future, a future destruction of the temple. And then Matthew, the writer, adds, let the reader understand, I know this is a riddle, I know this is a puzzle, I know this is hard to get, but bear with me. Then those who were in Judea must flee to the mountains. When you see this abomination of desolation, whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Now, there were Christians in the first century who had heard and read about the prophecy of Jesus, because Matthew wrote his prophecy down, and by the way, Mark and Luke give essentially the same prophecy, and who had heard the prophecy passed down, and perhaps had read, I think, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then who saw the rebellion take place in 66 AD of the Jews against the Romans, and the Romans came down with their armies, and the Christians in town said, oh, this isn't going to end very nicely because of this prophecy. There's coming this great tribulation. And they all got out of town. Eusebius, the early church historian, talks about how the Christians all left. And not only did they leave Jerusalem, they actually crossed over the Jordan River to the other side, modern day country of Jordan, and found refuge there. So they weren't there when this great tribulation came. Notice how Jesus says, such has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. And the words of Jesus sound remarkably like an eyewitness historian who was there to tell us the story of the fall of Jerusalem. And I'm speaking of Josephus. He was a Jewish general turned writer scholar who, in his eyewitness account called The Wars of the Jews, describes the fall of Jerusalem in this way. He says the entire nation, once the soldiers of the general Titus, Roman soldier, had come and surrounded Jerusalem, he says the entire nation was now shut up by fate as in a prison, and the Roman army encompassed the city, this is the city of Jerusalem, when it was crowded with inhabitants. Accordingly, the multitude of those that therein perished exceeded all the destructions that either men or God ever brought upon the world. You would almost think that he's quoting Jesus. I think he perhaps is quoting Daniel chapter 9 and putting it in the terms that he understands. He says, yes, he understands the Maccabean interpretation, but I think he saw, but wait a minute, there was a greater desolation and destruction that took place here. So that we have this prophecy of the temple. In the Maccabean interpretation, it sees Antiochus the fourth, Antiochus Epiphanes, this Seleucid king who had the high priest murdered, who came in 3.5 years later and desecrated the temple, set up an abomination of desolation, against whom the Maccabees eventually won their liberty. But you have a secondary, or maybe even a later primary fulfillment, not going to quibble, in the person of the Roman Emperor Titus, this Roman general who comes a generation after Jesus, the Messiah, has been crucified by the Romans, who himself destroyed the temple after the Christians had escaped. And there's a sense in which the prophecy points, yes, to the destruction of the temple, but you will remember how Jesus stood in the temple and said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." And then John chapter 2, verse 19 says, "But he was speaking of the temple of his body." You see, both temples were destroyed, but only one was rebuilt. And that is the spiritual temple, the temple of which we have become part if we trust in Jesus as our Messiah, as our Lord, as our victorious King.